Hey everyone, how's it going? Today I want to talk about the ever-elusive Schnellbomber, or fast bomber if you don't speak German. The concept, obviously German in either its origin or popularity, was pretty simple. It was to literally be a fast bomber that would forego the defensive turrets that were normally seen on bombers in exchange for an increase in speed, and hopefully the ability to simply outrun enemy fighters and interceptors. While a very interesting idea in theory, in practice, as we've talked about with many projects on this channel, actually making a bomber that outruns enemy fighters is incredibly difficult, especially if both sides of the conflict are on relatively equal technological footing. You know, if the fighters that one side are using are horribly outdated and technologically primitive comparatively, then sure, the fast bomber concept does work just fine. But due to several intermingling reasons, it's incredibly difficult to balance speed, bomber payload, and the plane's aerodynamics, and much more. Greater payloads require more space. More space and greater payloads require more engine power to move the plane. More engine power generally requires more engines. More engines generally require more engine nacelles. More nacelles increase the drag, increase the weight, and reduce performance, so on and so forth. This overall cascading and kind of looping effect effectively means that pretty much all aircraft that were designed as fast bombers ended up too slow to simply outrun the enemy fighters, and this then necessitated the addition of defensive weaponry. Inevitably, the fast bomber turns into just being fast for a bomber. These fast bombers were again largely a German thing, but if we look across the ocean at what America wanted in their bombers, we see a much different philosophy. These big, multi-engine, lumbering, defensive turrets everywhere, large payload bombers. But in the middle of World War II, America, and specifically one American company, decided to try and make what was effectively an American Schnellbomber, and if it was successful, it would basically be the Schnellbomber that Germany had been dreaming of for years. This is the Douglas Aircraft Company's Schnellbomber. This is the Douglas XB-42 Mixmaster. Beginning in early 1943 as a private venture from Douglas Aircraft, designer Ed Burton envisioned a pretty impressive aircraft, one that initially and admittedly had similar if lesser specifications to Britain's de Havilland Mosquito. Burton wanted to try and design a twin-engine bomber that could carry a 2,000-pound payload 2,000 miles, at a top speed of at least 400 miles an hour. Compared to the Mosquito B-16 model, the Mosquito actually had twice the payload and a slightly higher top speed, but also about 75% of that range. Ideally, this incredible speed, by bomber standards anyway, would allow Douglas Aircraft to reduce the design's defensive armament, reduce its weight, reduce the amount of resources needed, reduce its construction time, and reduce the amount of crew members needed. The initial hurdle for Burton and his team, though, was figuring out the optimal engine configuration, trying to find a way to have the aircraft be powered by two engines without there being a substantial increase in drag and thus decrease in performance. And what they would settle on was kind of similar to the Bell P-39 and the Dornier Do 335. Instead of having two separate engine nacelles on each wing, instead the fuselage itself would be the engine nacelle. Both engines would be buried in the fuselage, just behind the cockpit, paired up right next to each other. Throughout the rear half of the fuselage, extended drive shafts would connect the engines all the way to the tail, and in the tail would be a gearbox that drove a contra-rotating propeller system. ideally by both connecting both engines to a single propeller unit and using them in a pusher configuration. The wings and the forward surfaces of the design would be kept as clean as possible, significantly increasing aerodynamic efficiency and its overall flight performance. Douglas would submit this concept to the U.S. Army Air Force in May 1943, and a month later, they would issue a contract to Douglas for 2 prototypes, under the official designation of XA-42, initially given the A designation instead of the B, as it was initially classed as an attack aircraft rather than a bomber. Just a few months later, though, in November, the designation would then be altered by the Army Air Force to the XB-42, after they had the idea that potentially Douglas's design could be a smaller, cheaper alternative to the B-29 Superfortress. Measuring in at 16.36 meters long, 21.49 meters wide, and 5.74 meters tall, the XB-42, at least length and width-wise, was about half the size of the B-29, and at an empty weight of 20,888 pounds, it was less than a third of the weight of the B-29. Certainly in these areas, the XB-42 would be significantly more resource effective. For the XB-42's overall design, up in the nose, there would initially be 3 distinct crew member locations. For the pilot and co-pilot, each of them would have their own individual small bubble-style canopy, located right next to each other. Why exactly this was done, I'm not terribly sure, but it certainly created a rather interesting look. It made the plane look like it had eyes. Located just below them would be a glass nose that would house the bombardier, and that was it for the crew, just 3 men. Just behind the cockpit would be the twin engines, a pair of Allison V1710 liquid-cooled engines, initially with 1,325 horsepower apiece. For the cooling, the radiators would be moved over to the wing roots, and in the roots would be air intakes that followed along the leading edge. Around the middle of each wing would be the fuel tanks that would give the XB-42 a range of 1,800 miles and an absolute maximum range of around 5,000 miles, if the bomb bay was filled with extra fuel tanks and nothing else. Moving more towards the wing tips, the XB-42 would have its pretty minimal yet very interesting defensive armament. Realistically, it was more of a token defensive armament than anything else, but in each wing would be a rear-facing pair of 50 cal machine guns. These guns would have an interesting feature to them, though, where at the co-pilot's discretion, small flaps on the wings on either side of the turret would flip up and down, allowing the turrets to travel a little bit more, 25 degrees to either side, 30 degrees above, and 15 below, and this would all be controlled by the co-pilot. Again, this probably wouldn't have been much more than a token defensive armament, but as a just-in-case measure, the fact that it could be pretty seamlessly integrated into the trailing edge of the wing for minimal impact to the plane's aerodynamics was certainly a solid benefit. Back at the tail, along with the contra-rotating propellers, the tail would consist of 4 surfaces, 2 vertical and 2 horizontal, a pretty common layout for pusher props, as that lower vertical surface helps to protect the propeller. Because of the pusher prop, and probably the lack of space in the wings due to the radiators and the fuel tanks, it would have tricycle landing gear, and it was a little bit more complex than your standard tricycle gear. In addition to its nose wheel, the rear 2 wheels, instead of folding out from the wings, folded out from the lower side of the fuselage, and needed to rotate 180 degrees in the process. As the design would change from an attacker to a bomber, the intended payload on it would increase substantially, from its initial 2,000 pounds up to 8,000 pounds, all held in an internal bomb bay, and if it was needed, upwards of 10,000 pounds could be somewhat fit in the bay if the doors on it remained open. This obviously wouldn't be optimal, as it would increase drag and reduce speed considerably, but if needed, it could nevertheless be done. Given the rather unique nature of the XB-42's design, it's incredibly surprising that in less than a year, on May 6, 1944, the first XB-42 prototype would take to the air for the first time. Perhaps even more surprisingly, the performance of it in this initial flight was perceived to be incredibly promising. It wasn't without issue, to be sure, but while I couldn't find any initial data, the measured top speed was almost what they expected it to be, just a few miles an hour off, and its range and climb rate actually exceeded their expectations. In these performance categories, the XB-42 was excellent. On the negative side, though, there was a bit of instability and some propeller vibration, and both of these were exacerbated when the bomb bay doors were open. Additionally, the leading-edge cooling slots were found to be a bit insufficient, and the odd twin bubble canopies for the pilot and co-pilot were disliked by the pilot and co-pilot, as it hampered their ability to communicate. These problems were, for all intents and purposes, pretty minor though, and could probably be easily remedied. For example, on the second prototype, those twin canopies would be swapped out for a more conventional single one, and in the process it also received an upgrade to its engines, with stronger V1710s that had about 1,800 horsepower apiece. However, presumably due to the war coming to a close in 1945, progress on the XB-42 seemed to slow a bit, but in December 1945, the XB-42 managed to reach a top speed of 433 miles an hour, flying cross-country from Long Beach to DC. Such speed, with an 8,000 to 10,000 pound payload, was pretty much a bomber Germany could only dream of. Now, at this point, Germany had also fallen, but still. Only about a week later, though, on December 16th, the second XB-42 prototype would be completely destroyed after crashing during a test flight. It turns out the minor issue of insufficient cooling was a little bit more than minor. Whether it was due to plain old inefficiency or some kind of pilot error that impacted cooling, on that day there was a problem when they were going in for a landing. The landing gear failed to extend properly. So while they were circling and trying to fix that issue, one of the engines began to overheat and ended up failing. To keep themselves in the air, the remaining engine was ramped up to full power, and doing so also made it overheat and fail. So with faulty landing gear and no engines, while flying at a low altitude, the 3 crew members on board elected to bail out, and while all of them landed safely, the XB-42 was virtually obliterated. So with the second prototype gone, this left the first prototype as the lone XB-42 in existence, and this one still had and would keep the original twin bubble canopies. At this point, though, with World War II well over and military research and production starting to wind down a bit and lose urgency, the Air Force's interest in the XB-42 had significantly waned, and so too did any interest in the design as an attack aircraft. As an attacker, it was proposed that its armament would be, at minimum, 16 50 cal machine guns, which would have been incredibly intimidating. But with jet power coming more into prominence, and with the military overall having more time to just develop technology and not focus on the war, the XB-42 just wasn't nearly as interesting as it once was. Douglas would acknowledge the growing presence and desire for jet power, though, and in addition to another project that we'll get to in a second, for testing and experimental purposes, they took the lone XB-42 and modified it, not to be solely powered by jets, but partially as a mixed-power bomber. The alteration wasn't terribly complex or really elegant-looking. Under each wing, a Westinghouse 19XB turbojet was installed, with 1,600 foot-pounds of thrust apiece. Since the fuel tanks were in the wings, the total fuel capacity did have to be reduced a little bit to fit the jets, but for greater speed, I guess sacrifices had to be made. With these new engines and the new designation of XB-42A, Douglas projected that it would be able to reach top speeds near 500 miles an hour, and taking to the air on May 27, 1947, the 42A would reach a top speed of 488 miles an hour, a significant boost over the baseline XB-42. Later that year, though, after a rough landing would damage the tail and the lower vertical surface on it, it never took to the air again. It did get repaired, but due to ever-reducing interest, the project was cancelled in August 1948. As for the other project that Douglas embarked on around this time in the pursuit of jet power, instead of a mixed-power bomber, all the way back in early 1944, Douglas began design work on a purely jet-powered version of the XB-42, in what would be called the XB-43 Jetmaster. Due to significant delays and issues in its proposed powerhouse, a pair of General Electric J-35 turbojets with nearly 4,000 foot-pounds of thrust apiece, it wouldn't be until May 17, 1946 that it took to the air. But even with the 2-year or so delay, it still made history as America's first purely jet-powered bomber. The design of it was effectively just the early version of the XB-42, with the twin bubble canopies and all, just with a powerhouse swap. The swap did have trickle-down effects on the design, though, with the air intakes being changed from little slits in the wing roots to square-shaped cutouts on either side of the cockpit. And also, due to not having the pusher prop anymore, the vertical surface on the underside of the tail was removed, and the tail looked a bit more typical and standard. Once in the air, the XB-43 would hit a top speed just over 500 miles an hour, somewhere between 503 and 515. And while it was a little bit faster than the XB-42A, for a prospective fast jet bomber with a now actually kind of small bomb load of 8,000 pounds, it just wasn't fast enough, it still suffered from control issues, and it really didn't have the offensive capabilities that could offset those other deficiencies. The introduction of a second prototype with a single canopy didn't really change anything, and while testing of the XB-43 continued into the 1950s, nothing much came of the project, and by late 1953, the XB-43 project was over. By that time, jet-powered fighter bombers like the F-84 Thunderjet, the F-84F Thunderstreak, and the F-100 Super Sabre, they were either in service or in development, and all of them, while having a lesser payload, would have speeds above 600 miles an hour. So if you wanted speed in your bomber, then those fighters would do the job just fine. And if it was payload that you were after, planes like the mixed-power B-36 Peacemaker and the jet-powered B-52 Stratofortress were also in service or in development, and those ones had payloads over 70,000 pounds. Basically, even though the XB-42 and 43 were incredibly promising, high-performing bombers in the late World War II era, the introduction and rapid evolution of jet power completely left them in the dust. In the end, the XB-42 Mixmaster, while certainly an interesting design, ended up becoming just another propeller power aircraft that was killed by the end of the war and the transition to jet power. Now, could the design have been saved if stronger turbojet engines were installed that drastically increased the speed? Honestly, probably not. Those jet-powered fighter bombers had payloads in the range of 4,000 to 6,000 pounds, which really wasn't much of a step down over what the XB-42 could hold, and they would offer much greater versatility as fighters. If the XB-42 was to survive, its design would need a substantial overhaul, either a major size reduction to increase speed and maneuverability, or a major size increase to increase payload. And at that point, it wouldn't really be the XB-42 anymore, it would just be a new design. Basically, the way for the XB-42 to succeed after the war was for it to not be what it was. Alright, and with that, we're going to go ahead and end for today. So, thank you all for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. I forgot to mention why it's called the Mixmaster. It's because the contra-rotating propellers looked like they'd be good for mixing. Ergo, the Mixmaster. I kinda wish we named more things like that. Like, hey, it kinda looks like this other thing, so let's name it that other thing. Now, that'd probably start to get confusing after a little while, but, you know. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something. So, see ya.